All right, here we go. Coffee with the Founder. Today we're here with uh, another good friend and colleague, Vanessa Roberts. And she's just been really supporting and doing some great work, supporting both the conference, the Privilege Institute, and doing great work. Vanessa, what we've been really trying to do with our guests is introduce many people to the folks who are part of the White Privilege Conference, the Privilege Institute, but most people meet y'all at the conference, so they don't know about the work you're doing when you leave the conference. So this is really our chance to give people a real in-depth look at the real people that are really doing the work, not only as they do it and show it at the conference, but what they do when they get back home. So I'm just excited that you're here. And what I wanted to start with is just imagine I meet you on the train or I meet you at the bus stop, and you have to introduce yourself, your work, your research, your expertise to me or to our listening audience. Who is Vanessa Roberts?
That's a good question, Dr. Eddie. So Vanessa Roberts, pronouns she, her, hers. I am a lot of things. I used to joke that I should have a business card that says Vanessa Roberts, I do stuff. My primary joy at the moment is being the executive director of a youth serving organization called Project Voice. That's VOYCE. The acronym stands for Voices of Youth Creating Equity. I took over the leadership role May 2019, but I've been associated with the nonprofit since spring of 2016 when I was brought in as a graduate student researcher to help them rethink their summer leadership curriculum. Fell in love, was invited to be a facilitator, and just kept coming back, paid and unpaid. Wound up partnering with the organization as my dissertation community organization. So I wound up, oddly enough, researching Project Voice for 2 years before taking the helm, as you might say. So my research, my other, job is being a doctoral candidate of sociology at the University of Colorado Boulder. My research areas are youth development, race, ethnicity, and cultural sociology, really trying to figure out what it is that drives, shifts, motivates young folks to think of themselves as becoming capable of producing transformative social change. So that's my jam. And on top of all that, I'm happily married. We have 3 little rescue dogs. I cook a lot, getting into gardening again, and lots of houseplants, lots of love. And the side hustle is doing performance-based social justice, diversity education, sort of on a client-by-client basis. I never advertise myself. It's always word of mouth. And so I really enjoy those opportunities to go out and engage with folks and facilitate conversation.
Now, you mentioned something that I think people hear a lot, which is youth development.
Yeah.
And I just wonder what that means today. I can imagine as I was growing up, I mean, I don't even know if those terms really were in existence and even what they meant back in the 70s and 80s, early 80s when I was coming up. But for you today, what does that mean when you talk about the work you do with youth development? What does that mean in today's time?
There's a lot of different approaches to it. So Project Voice as an organization falls under the larger umbrella of positive youth development, which was this pushback against seeing young folks from a deficit-based perspective. So this notion that there's something missing, they have to be fixed, they have to be saved. And it flipped it into an asset-based approach, looking at young folks as human adults in development, right? This process of becoming, like, how do you nurture and facilitate this healthy, positive youth development? But as a scholar, a part of my research was looking into the critiques of positive youth development and how it can get itself wrapped up in neoliberalism, in which you place the burden of change and the responsibility of transformation solely on the individual instead of looking at the larger systems of oppression which have led to them being in the position they're in. And I say all that not to get too bogged down in the theory, but I say all that for me, youth development is really, in my approach, trying to figure out how best to work with youth. So how do you form healthy youth adult partnerships that are based in equity so that the experience, the exchange, this process of developing a young person to fully come into the full reach and span of their talents, how does that happen in partnership with an adult so that both parties can be enriched? I think it is really problematic when we take this one-sided approach to working with young people that we as adults somehow have all the knowledge or all the expertise, whereas I am not a teenager in 2020. So how can I speak to what that experience is for you and what you're navigating and negotiating? And instead, how can we both bring things to the table and use that to collectively work on change, to produce change, do a project, whether it's a local project, neighborhood project, school, state, or national.
Yeah. What I'm fascinated about this topic of youth development and its evolution. You know, at the White Privilege Conference, we'd like to have young people involved and participating in all aspects. But I'm often wondering, what is the current state of young people today? Because there's lots of thoughts about, you know, this old racist, sexist, homophobic, oppressive generation dying off. And we got this refreshing new crop of young people that are gonna usher in a new, open, accepting, inclusive society. And I'm just, based on some of the work and research you're doing with young people, how would you describe the state of the young person today, particularly as it relates to issues of diversity and inclusion, but even more the issues that we look at around white supremacy, white privilege? Is there interest? Is there commitment? Is there involvement? What are you seeing in the world of young people you're operating in today?
It's a mixed bag, Dr. Eddie. So there are pockets of young folks who are really hungry for the opportunity to become activated. And by activated, I mean to have an experience which allows them to understand that they can have a role in this current moment, that they can have a role in advocating for racial equity, social equity, and they just often need to be presented with an opportunity, right? So it's not about like rescuing anybody. It's about offering them the tools, the skills, the resources, and leveraging your own power and privilege as an advocate in order to create that perfect storm moment for a young person to be like, oh, wait, I do care. How do I do this? How do I engage? And being that moment or creating that moment is something that I think got me hooked, right? I keep coming back to this work because of those like aha, highlight, I want to do this type of experience. But it's hard for me to generalize about the state of young people today. I think that the work I do at Project Voice, we get a range of young folks who are interested in becoming leaders, but maybe don't think it's for them because they're, the majority of our students are low income. They're often, majority are youth of color, right? They're multiply marginalized in different ways. And so they've been used to receiving this message of sit down, shut up, and do as you're told. And so one of the biggest hurdles coming in as an adult is getting over that hurdle or that hump of them actually believing that you care, of them actually believing that you're not gonna dismiss them, that you're actually going to listen to respond and understand and not just listen to get your own thoughts in. And there are some really powerful young folks that I get to work with. And so I think my viewpoint might be a bit skewed these past like 3-4 years. But I've also taught at the college level. And so I've had college classrooms where you have everything from, you know, well-intentioned young white identified folks who would come into my race ethnicity course and have their minds blown and come to office hours to say, what can I do, right? How can I navigate this legacy of white supremacy that I was born into? How do I do something with this information? Because you hit them, right? It's a college level course, so you just hit them with all these statistics and reports and articles and theory and history. And so that can be a lot for some of them to process. On the flip side, you also have, I experience students of color coming to office hours, you know, expressing gratitude for having a classroom experience in which we were able to hold and have difficult conversations because that wasn't the experience they were having. As we know, higher ed is rife with the legacy of white supremacy. And so talking about race is taboo, it's, you know, shied away from, and we don't have the skill sets often as educators to engage in a rigorous conversation. So I had students at the college level who I would bring to White Privilege Conference, right, to give them that experience, to give them that network, to not feel so like a fish out of water. I think sometimes that can be the concern or the fear is, what if I'm the only one in my friend group who cares or is concerned? How do I find connection and support and fellowship? Because this work can be exhausting and overwhelming. And that's one of the things I've really recognized again this year, missing WPC, is that family feel of the folks I've gotten to know over this decade. Y'all know it's been a decade now since I've been part of WPC. And for young folks, I think they are really, really hungry and are looking for an opportunity to get involved. But on the flip side, I'm not gonna, you know, lie to you. You do have some students who are being indoctrinated into, you know, the belief of, you know, the white race is in peril. Culture is being, you know, repressed, that they are now experiencing racism, right? That being white and male is the most um, hated on category. They need rescuing. Like, so there's also a whole lot of tension in some of these narratives of this upcoming generation healing the world. I think that that is too simplistic, quite frankly.
Do you work in being around so many young people over your work and research? Do you feel like the challenge is more with the parents, the time they've spent in their most innocent state being shaped by groups of people? Or is it the challenges that they'll face in the world ahead of them that, I mean, really, we have really no sense of what's to come based on the demographic change, the rise in white supremacy and white supremacy groups, hate crimes, the inequalities that we see continuing across our nation. I mean, there's just a list of things that we can name that are ahead of young people. And I wonder if we have to, or we're maybe facing a time that I'm not sure which of those two challenges is the most, but I'm just asking you, how would you respond if you had to choose which of those is the toughest thing that you're facing in the work you're doing with young people? What they bring to the table, or what's ahead of them in reference to the world that they're going to have to live in and lead in?
That's tough. I'm now thinking about individual young folks I know, right? And like seeing like which way I would go. I don't know, Dr. E. I think for most of the young folks I know, I try to accept them where they are when I meet them, not to erase their history or erase their set of experiences, but I don't want that to limit what I might think they're capable of, if that makes sense. Because as much as I've been doing, quote unquote, the work, I know that I still have ingrained biases that I may not be aware of unless they get challenged or tested. And so I never want to assume because, a young person comes from a background which stereotypically would not lead them to be successful. Those are the students we seek out, right? Like we seek out students who are often overlooked by their leadership programs and haven't been conditioned to think of themselves as leaders, right? They haven't been conditioned to think of themselves as exceptional. So I would probably lean more towards the latter half of your proposition, that it is more the challenges that they face, which are absolutely intricately linked to the circumstances they come from. Because there's no way to ignore your familial environment, what you understand as normal, what you've been set up to expect is possible. There's no way to ignore that as you then get ready to face various challenges that are coming at you. So there's just the hope that somewhere in that transition to adulthood, they encounter someone who is able to be a positive influence in the sense of actually doing the work of empowering. And like I shy away from that word empowerment, right? Because I think it's one of those like cute catchphrases where you have folks like, I empower young folks. And I'm like, yeah, what do you do? Like, how do you do it? How do you know? Did they tell you? And they're like, but no, I gave them a book. And I'm like, that's great. So it's like, that's a little bit of extreme of an example, but I really do think that it's a combination of taking into account like the historical context and then the familial context and seeing how you can leverage your personal narrative and your personal experience in order to gain access to that which you've defined as success. So it's not just success in terms of, getting a college degree. If they want a college degree, hell yeah, I'll support them in doing that. But I think we've been sold a false dream of education as the only route to success. I think that if you look at how degrees are overinflated, at how student loan debt can it can cripple you for the future to a certain extent, I'm really invested in redefining what success looks like, student by student by student.
Hmm. Well, I'm wondering, as we think about this question of what they bring to the table, the challenges ahead, the subject matter that we deal with primarily at the conference is white supremacy, white privilege, other forms of oppression.
Mhm.
In your experience, what age is a kid ready for this subject matter? I mean, if handled correctly by the educator,
Yeah.
what would you suggest in reference to a starting point around this subject matter, white supremacy, white privilege, and other forms of oppression? And I primarily ask because I think this will be one of the reigning issues as we look ahead over the next 25 years. So what's your sense if a parent came to you and said, I've heard about this conference, I've heard you are familiar with this subject matter. Is my kid ready for this at the third grade? And what would you suggest? I mean, what are some of your thoughts about age appropriateness of this subject matter?
So I'll just make the caveat that I'm not an early childhood educator, and I have some fabulous colleagues. So if a parent came to me, what I often do is I point them to Makai Kellogg, who one of my fellow biracial, multiracial caucus facilitators. She does fabulous work in this arena, and she has developed curriculum guides and activities, and she runs a group for parents of biracial mixed race children, which gets into these issues of oppression and supremacy. And I would point, I have pointed folks to her for that area of expertise, but I have also given a handful of presentations. I was invited once to give a workshop to a group called MOPS, Mothers of Preschoolers. And they were having this conversation because something came up where some child had said something that got these folks into a tizzy. And so that's often, as you know, facilitators, consultants often get brought in after the fact. So I was brought in after the fact to address this. And I did a good bit of research before this presentation. And depending on what resource you access, there are studies which suggest that young children are being conditioned essentially from that moment of awareness, right? So from those like even like 6 months on, when they start recognizing faces, start recognizing shapes, like you have this concept of if a child has never been exposed to someone of a different race, then they have a fear reaction when they see someone of a different race because it's strange, it's other. So I would argue that as soon as children start making these cognitive developments in which we start to develop binary thinking because it's simple, right? It's good, bad, safe, harmful, familiar, unfamiliar, that those are moments in which we have to look at what they're being exposed to. So are all of the dolls, right, one color? Are all of your books featuring a male protagonist, right? Are all of your stories centered around like Christian normativity or heteronormativity? So like really starting to think about what are these influences which then lead to that makeup of your worldview. Like what paradigm are you imprinting on the child that includes understandings of race and racial difference? Now, the question of like when is it appropriate to have that first conversation, that's a decision that I would leave to parents, right? I don't have children of my own. And if and when I have children of my own, I know it's a conversation that we would engage in very early, but through these more diverse learning materials, which you can readily access now. I just sent some supplies and books and things to a friend of mine who has some young kids, and there's um, a whole like motley assortment of wonderful new books which feature women of color as inventors and scientists and teachers and astronauts, and really going into this beautifully diverse representation, which then opens up the opportunity to then have a conversation in which you can talk about race-based differences, not coming from a place of fear and not coming from a place of shame. I think that's the big, big thing, is not shaming a child for recognizing difference.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the right answer is to that. That's why I love asking this question and getting a variety of responses and contributions from friends and colleagues. And I just really hope as we look at the horizon of what we're facing as a nation, that this subject matter becomes a part of what we engage our kids around. One other thing you sparked in talking about Makai and the work that y'all are doing around multiracial identity is just that. I feel like our nation is just scratching the surface around multiracial identity. I mean, we really don't know what diversity is, if you ask me. I think Kip Fulbrecht's book around the future of multiracial kids that he put together was just a brilliant display of just the variety that we're going to see people showing up in over the next 25, 50 years. So what's your sense of the world? I mean, let's just say America's preparation for what they're calling the browning of America, which I'm sometimes concerned about because it still feels like people think about that in black, white. But talk a little bit about when you say multiracial identity, what does that mean? And
Yeah.
what kinds of issues are you seeing that are possibly budding up now that if we don't begin to tackle, grapple, can really become a big part of some unforeseen consequences, circumstances over these next 25 years when it comes to multiracial identity?
I think so. That's so funny you asked that question. There's many ways that I can answer this, and we only have so much time. But as part of my graduate program, I wound up, I'm a qualitative scholar. Let me just say this. I'm ethnographer, right? Qualitative methods all the way. But I chose sociology for my doctorate specifically because I wanted to understand mixed methods and I wanted to have a sense of quant logic. And I wound up taking an advanced course called the social demography of race. And I have no interest in becoming a demographer, but I am fascinated by what they do. And I struck a deal with the professor, Jason Boardman. And I said, look, Jason, I want to take your class, but I refuse to download any sort of like data or SPSS. Like, I don't want to crunch any equations. I don't want to write you a stats paper. Can I write you a theory paper? And he was like, yeah, this sounds great. And so I'm taking this course and I'm with all these other quant scholars. And so, you know, the hustle when it's not your field, you have to do like 10 times as much work. So I'm like doing all this extra, like it took me, I think 5 hours to read one 20-page article because I'm looking up all these terms and trying to figure all these things out. And I started to recognize, like reading all these contemporary demography articles, this was only 3 years ago, that these scholars kept saying like, oh, and there were X amount of people who opted more than one race on this survey, but we dropped them from the equation, right? Again and again and again. Just this dismissal and this refusal to deal with the messiness of folks choosing more than one racial category, or this concept that folks change racial identity over time. So you think about folks that I've met at the White Privilege Conference and the Biracial Multiracial Caucus. One of the reasons why I love that space is because you have ages high school to well-seasoned seniors in the room sharing experiences. And there's folks across that age spectrum who might for the first time be identifying out loud as biracial or as multiracial. So what are they going to check on the next census? And how are we going to navigate that 10 years ago, they may have checked Black, but 10 years later, now they're checking more than one box. And so I wound up writing this theory paper, which I never pushed to actually do anything with in terms of publication, because I got, caught up in other things and nervous about my argument. But the argument was that there needs to be a new theory in social demography about race, because we can't keep ignoring folks who refuse to fit, right? Folks who trouble the cleanness of racial categories and racial lines. And I refuse to adhere to, this rainbow baby racial savior narrative. I think that it's more of like a rainbow baby gonna come mess up all your tropes type of a narrative, right? Where biracial, multiracial folks are really pushing back against what we're being told we're allowed to be as people of color. So you have, folks who are all different types of blends who we can't play the racial hierarchy game as neatly and as cleanly. Because if you have someone who's mixed with two non-white racial categories, how are you going to rank them right on that list? And I think that there is absolutely evidence to suggest, as you were saying, that there is, there are multiple studies which say that the fastest growing census category is that more than one box, biracial, multiracial. And we haven't figured out yet what that means. right? We haven't figured out yet what does that mean for these race-based groups, right? What does that mean for race-based affiliation? Because when I'm in that caucus space, or the handful of times that I've gotten to do a keynote about being biracial or multiracial, the amount of folks who come up with like this huge sense of relief to say, no one's told me it's okay to say this out loud, or no one's told me it's okay to identify as more than one thing, or no one's told me it's okay to not be ashamed of being both white and something, right? Or being both, um, Mexican and African American Black. Like, there's a lot of conversations that I don't know our current racial paradigm for racial dialogue is equipped to properly handle. So I don't know. That's my answer. It's not really a clean answer,
No,
but
that's
it's a
that's
question.
that's just good stuff there. It raises another question because I'm so often. I was just talking with Dr. Darren Smith about
Mm,
transracial adoption and primarily white families, kids of color. And so, what you had me thinking about was um, uh, a question around: is it tougher for white parents with multiracial, biracial kids,
mm,
or let's say the person of color parent? In my case, black parent, because I
mhm.
think often I get off easier in reference to being black as if I know more or
Yeah.
I understand more. And I'm not saying that I don't have some of that knowledge, but I do find myself in some cases dealing with a multiracial, biracial son, not knowing, do I insist on being a black man until you can choose, right? Like, um, so anyway, just my own kind of challenge. But my question to you is, are you seeing in your work, research, and your experience, or what kind of challenges you're seeing possibly, um, as opposed to ranking them with white parents versus the parents of color when it comes to biracial, multiracial kids?
Dr. Eddie, it's going to depend on the parent, right? Um, I think you have, and I have met white parents of biracial, multiracial kids who have done the work to educate themselves, right? They are actively aware of the fact that their child's experience will be different from their experience moving through the world as someone with a greater amount of melanin, right? Um, in my case, my mother is German, so was a German citizen. So I often joke with folks when I try to mess with them that I'm the child of an immigrant, and then I just pause. I'm like, yeah, but she's blonde, blue-eyed from Germany. I'm like, right? So I just mess with people. But my mother, Germany has its own relationship with race, and Germans of my mother's age, I would say, and this is, I don't want to make too vast of generalization. My mother and her family, I'll keep it there, wanted to be race blind, right? They wanted to be colorblind. And my mother imposed this upon my brother and I in this really intense way, where I didn't understand myself as a person of color until my freshman year of college. Like, I had been raised with this, I call it like veil or shield of white privilege, where I assumed people saw me for who I am and didn't ascribe certain expectations or stereotypes or limitations on me because of the tint of my skin. And so I was shook when I first was called black. I was like, no, no, I'm not black, I'm half German. And folks were like, dude, like you're black. And like trying to navigate that versus my very black father who's been in my life the whole time, like, don't want to get it twisted, right? He just chose to opt out of the race-based conversation. And he sort of just deferred to my mother, and being in the military, he was gone quite a bit. So when it came to race conversations, they just didn't really happen. And so I think that's part of the reason why I am who I am today in terms of doing the work that I do, because I felt denied or deprived in some ways of the richness of Black experience as a young person. And I have to balance that with this beautifully abundant growing up experience I had as a little German kid, right? Like in Germany with my mom's family, getting pampered and privileged and exposed to all sorts of things that, you know, white wealth can bring you, right? Going to operas and musicals and learning to ski in the Alps. Like, what? Like, I don't even know what that means. But how do I then balance that with feeling sort of disconnected or afraid of Black folks for a good chunk of my early adult life? And then having the great fortune of having a Black male professor in college, Dr. C.W. Dawson Jr., he taught the philosophy of race, which introduced me to critical race theory. And so now I'm about 19 and had my mind blown, and was all of a sudden given a language and a frame for processing and understanding my mother's refusal to see race, right, or color, and my father's like willingness to not engage with it because as a Black man had experienced all sorts of stuff growing up in Baltimore. He really appreciated the German experience of being an American soldier, not so much a Black American soldier, and like navigating that for himself. He fell in love with German culture, like we've talked about it often, to now as a woman in my mid 30s who has increasingly sought more and more connections with Blackness, and have formed close relationships with my Black family and have close Black friends of all genders, on top of, yeah, a really rich like set of white friends and like friends in between if we're going to play like the racial spectrum game, right? But actively seeking out Blackness was something that I had to do, and it still makes my mother uncomfortable or upset if I talk too much about race, right? If I talk about concerns as a mixed race queer couple where my spouse and I can comfortably live, like those types of conversations, she goes, oh, I don't want to talk about that. Like, I don't like to think about it. And I'm like, well, that's privilege. And so having to navigate that, if my mother were a different type of white woman, I think it would be a different conversation. Like I've met incredible people at White Privilege Conference who are committed to critiquing their experience, right? They're committed to unpacking their role in these exchanges. They're committed to unpacking how they show up, what their positionality is, and how that impacts others around them. And so I could see the child of a white person coming from that that motivation, or coming from that sort of energy, having a very different experience than other biracial mixed race kids for whom, you know, their whiteness might be demonized, right? If they grew up with their family members who are all Black, or their family members who are all folks of color, then it's, you know, the whiteness in you is problematic and, you know, discouraged, discredited, you're not Black enough. So there's a spectrum of experiences. And I don't think it's fair to think that, like you were saying, that because you're, you know, the Black parent, that you've got this on lock.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I think that's really difficult because there's all different ways to parent, and there's all different ways to talk or not talk about race. My brother's experience of being biracial is very much mitigated by his gender. So my brother wasn't able to escape race-based associations as much as I was. But that's his story, so I'm not gonna share his story.
Well, I think part of thinking about this is just because of the demographic, I mean, just wave of change that's on the horizon. And for myself, experiencing some of that now, just thinking about what the need for that as we look at the next 25 years. Well, speaking of the next 25 years, COVID-19, who knows what this is going to do to the future? But I'm
Yeah.
wondering just right now with your work with young people, what's your sense of how young people are dealing with this pandemic, this quarantine, as it relates to COVID-19 in their day-to-day lives?
Again, it's a really varied experience. And I think I have to sometimes pinch myself that I get to do the work that I do. Um, and it's hard for me to stop working. I know you know what I mean, right? To have those boundaries because you love it and you're in it and you're so committed. But right now, so Project Voice, as I mentioned, is a youth development, youth leadership program. So we take young folks and introduce them to various opportunities to help develop that, provide them support resources. So with this COVID-19 pandemic, we are no longer able to do our in-person programming. And in this moment of panic that sort of like temporarily set in for us, so I have to back up and say, I have an incredible board chair who's a retired Army who had us begin crisis management prepping February 23rd. So I don't know when other orgs were starting to think about this, but the end of February, we were starting to think about how we would transition to virtual programming. And when that transition started to happen, because our students are 80 to 85% of them qualify for free and reduced lunch, the danger of food scarcity is real. And so I quickly shot off some emails to our funders asking for permission to reallocate the monies already set aside for program meals and supplies to the creation of community care packages so that we could try to buffer for those families who didn't have the extra money to go stock up to stay at home for 2 weeks. The families who didn't have the money to purchase like extra vitamins or extra things like that to help boost your natural ability to stay healthy. And so we knocked out this like first round of care packages, and all of a sudden I had some of our youth leaders being like, hey, how do we help? And so now we've got a couple of them who have taken over the organizing of this community care package. They have shifted it so instead of purchasing from big box stores, I've given them prepaid visas and they go purchase from the little locally owned stores, right? So they're visiting the mercados and the carnicieras, right? They're visiting like the Asian Pacific market and trying to keep the money in the community to then purchase these supplies for the care packages. They're organizing volunteers to deliver them. So at the moment, that's like a really concrete part of our work is physically taking care of the families and their neighbors and the community that we serve. And then the other side of it is navigating how do we do this online. So young people, not all of them are okay, Dr. Eddie. I mean, you have to think about home is not a safe place for everybody. Not everybody has a supportive environment to fall back on. And so we are in this moment, we've already done 2 versions. We have another show coming up tomorrow night at 8 p.m., which is an art-based response to COVID-19. So we're doing these Facebook live streams with some local teaching artists who I was able to use funds to contract and hire, right? Because they had their livelihood cut out. And they're working with, I think it's 12 youth participants to plan these art-based social justice healing conversations to give youth a space in which to process what they're feeling.
Mm.
And that's one example of the type of the work. We're also getting ready to drop a bunch of podcasts that youth are doing interviews with folks doing like ethnic studies or local politicians and leaders or like other youth who care about stuff. And so I've got a great team. We're small but mighty. We're all folks of color. And I think that's unique in and of itself that we reflect the students that we serve. And yeah, I don't know really what to expect, what to come next. We do a really intensive summer leadership program that's in person for 6 weeks, meant to kick off end of June. fingers crossed we're still allowed to do it. But if not, we're trying to get creative while still making sure people don't go to bed hungry or people don't, you know, end up not having access to what they need to have access to. And so I am predicting, based on the conversations I've been overhearing from within a 6-foot safe distance, right? When we're making those care packages, we got masks and gloves, everybody's 6 feet apart. But the conversations I've been overhearing are these deeper questions of why, right? And that's what gets me excited, because those are those activation moments of, well, why don't we have the money to go and buy extra supplies, right? Why are essential workers at these grocery stores the least protected? And why were they just now labeled essential? Why don't we have reliable Wi-Fi in our homes but are still expected to perform at the same level as our peers who have like the fastest speed? Why do I have to navigate working on this tiny little tablet when my friend who comes from a wealthier zip code has a MacBook or whatnot? So there's those questions of why, I think, could lead to a really interesting youth-led research project. That's also what we do. We give them tools to do research, conduct surveys, read a bunch of stuff, and put forth an argument and a policy change. So I don't know. I'm excited though. In spite of all the grief and in the uncertainty, I have faith in the resiliency of the young folks we work with.
Yeah, well, it's because of you, my pessimistic term was created. As you see on the front of my sweatshirt, pessimistic means you're optimistic, but you're taking action.
Yeah.
And you, my friend, are a great example of folks who are not only talking the talk, but walking the walk. I want to close out with a little fun to ask you,
Okay.
what are you watching that maybe you've learned something from, or something you've streamed, a show you binged on that just takes you away, just lets you just chill out for a minute? We're trying to share some streaming suggestions to our listening audience so we can have a buffet of options for everybody to be either learning or just to get away.
You gonna laugh at me, Dr. Eddie. I'm a nerd. We've been playing Dominion and Settlers of Catan and card games. So I'm trying to think the last thing we watched. So my spouse, she's really into like those true crime type of stuff.
Gotcha.
Right. And so I think the last thing we watched was some sort of true crime. And then we did watch that horrible Lion King thing. Tiger King. We did Lion King, right? We watched it just so that we could talk about it with people.
Yeah.
And understand all the memes. So Tiger King, if you watch it from a critical perspective, it's palatable. And it gets weirder and weirder as it goes on. Just when you think it can't get weird enough, it gets worse. And could lead to a lot of interesting conversations about representations of whiteness and representations of power and sexuality and class differences and animal rights, and could be interesting.
Yeah. I'm not even going to say anything about Tiger King. I'm just going to leave it there. Listen, I appreciate you dropping knowledge and all the work you're doing, especially with young people, and really empowering or equipping or informing. But what I like most is you're listening. You're hearing what they're saying, what they need, what they want, and acting from that vantage point as opposed to what we think is best for them as the adult. And I just respect that and appreciate that. And you're always welcome at WPC, and we're looking forward to calling you Dr. Vanessa Roberts.
It's a coming.
So, keep us posted on that. And thank you again. Take care of yourself. Be safe. And I look forward to when we can do a real face-to-face human hug again.
Yeah, I'm deprived. So. All right. Love to you, Dr. Eddie, and the whole Privilege family, Privilege Institute family, White Privilege Conference. I can't even say how much I appreciate y'all. You were so formative when I first encountered you in 2005 in Colorado Springs, White Privilege Conference. It was 2005, 2006, one of those years, and just changed my world. So you are a huge part of why I do what I do, because you introduced me to the relationship model. You introduced me to this concept of calling folks in instead of calling them out, and that has shaped me as a facilitator in a way that I can't even express. So thank you.
Appreciate you. Take care of yourself. We'll be in
All
touch.
right.
Peace.
Take care.
Peace.
Bye.
Okay. We're working the graveyard shift tonight, Jenny.
We are. I think you gotta stop recording.
Oh, yes. I think I should.